of years before. But to give you an example of how widespread this kidnapping and selling into servitude was, according to Edward Channing in the History of the United States, there were 10,000 English whites kidnapped for this purpose in 1 year, 1670 alone. Now do the math for well over 100 years. Yep, whites were slaves too, even before the first African was brought into America. And when one can scarcely think of whites as slaves, the mind first thinks, well, surely they were treated better, right, than what we hear the black slaves were treated later on. But in the documents, when you dig deep, paint a very different story. Like those found in the records of Middlesex Country, Virginia, whippings were commonplace, as were iron collars and chains. The horrifying treatment was not an uncommon reality of whites in bondage in the colonies, but it was so common, in fact, that the whipping of white slaves resulted in so many being beaten to death that in 1662, the Virginia Assembly passed a law prohibiting the private burial of white slaves because such burials helped to conceal murders by their masters. The colonial records are simply chock full of the death of white servants by beatings and starvation and exposure, yet you'll find no conviction of the murder of their masters, only innocence, perhaps due in part to the fact that it was only the propertied white class, and therefore for whom white slavery was very profitable, that were allowed to serve on a jury. White slaves and white servants were forbidden this privilege. Look, this certainly is not a look who suffered contest. I am forced to point out a very deep, dark fact about our nation's history because of this contrived narrative that is today using the lies by the offspring of the same elites that today are causing so many of us to openly hate and persecute each other right now. This omission of our true past is a crime in and of itself. The horrendous story of black slaves, and it was a horrendous story, has been told over and over and over. But the horrendous story of white servitude and slavery has been completely and purposefully hidden. There are even channels and propaganda right now trying to say that if you speak about white slavery, you yourself are a white supremacist. What? Shouldn't it be obvious that admitting to the most humiliating human experience in existence, that of slavery, is about as opposite of supremacist as you can get? Why shouldn't we learn from our horrible mistakes, all of them, of the wrong ways we treated all people? Meanwhile, the tons of Irish slaves brought into America suffered horrible prejudices for many centuries following. Prejudices for simply being Irish, effectively preventing them from getting jobs or housing. Signs like this all over America at that time were not uncommon. Perhaps because the story of white slavery was hidden in the retelling of American history and never told through American media. Perhaps that alone helped the Irish to more easily move on with their lives and so flourish. Again, the psychological damage inflicted upon blacks through perpetuating them as the only slave race, this relentless narrative that has been hung over their heads for decades as the victim culture, is extremely damaging to them. Shouldn't it be a relief that they're not the only ones? That they could perhaps make them feel not so alone in this measure? But again, that is not what our keepers want. They want to keep only a certain people in the clutches of the psychological slavery that exists in the mind and spirit that is victimhood. And that woman you saw earlier, I think she was Jamaican American. She didn't have it.
Blacks are oppressed. I am black. I'm not oppressed. I am free.
That's good for you. That's an individual person. What about a systemic issue?
Where? I do what I want. You have the skills. This is a country where you have the skills. You want to do what you want. You do it. Stop forcing on people to accept that they're oppressed. They are not. I am not oppressed. I am black.
The victimhood narrative is damaging, and it is a lie. It's like having a wound, a deep cut of a wound. And just as it starts to scab over and heal, you rip it off and have to start over with the pain all over again, inflicting the trauma over and over with each new story of victimhood. thus preventing the healing from ever happening. If peace is what they wanted, they wouldn't cut the blacks that were standing together with the whites out of the picture.